Hey, so as you may have gathered from the title of this video, I'm going to show you some signed books today. Before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about what signed books means and doesn't mean to me. I'm not actually the biggest collector of signed books. I love the books that you're about to see. They all mean something to me, but I don't go out of my way to buy a lot of signed books. I love horror stories. Whether they're on the written page, whether they're in the form of a film, whether they're a comic book. I love great original horror stories, and that's my passion. So the value of these books is 99% the stories being told. I'm not a Kindle guy. I do like a physical book, and that's a good percent of that final percentage is having something that I can hold in my hand and put on a shelf and be proud of. That said, I know a lot of people tend to keep every book they've ever read. I hear that a lot in the horror community, and that's not me either. If I love a book but I'll never read it again, I will pass it on to someone else and hope that they do the same, because I'd love these stories to get read by as many people as humanly possible. As a creator, I know that's what I would like, so maybe that does inform how I am as a reader and as a collector. But it really doesn't matter. The books that I'm about to show you are all ones that are personal treasures, and it's for a lot of reasons. These are some of my favorite books, period, and that certainly helps. The fact that they're by some incredible writers who personally mean something to me is probably what makes the signatures valuable. Now, of these, I will say there's two that are not horror books, but I think you might be interested, and I really don't have another place to show these on the channel, so I'm just going to squeeze them in here. Hopefully you're cool with that. That is Stormcloud the cat in the back, and she will be joining us tonight apparently. So, you know, if you want to leave a message under this video about your favorite books, absolutely do. If you own a signed edition or a really nice limited edition or a first printing of something, leave a comment on that. Or if you just want to say hi to Stormcloud, you can do that in the comments below too. First up, and this shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, is a book that is my favorite modern horror novel by my favorite living horror author. And that would be Prototype by the great Brian Hodge. Now, Brian's a friend of the show. He's been on the show. He's an amazing, amazing person, and he deserves everyone's support. This came out from Dark Essentials. It was a paperback originally from Del Abyss, and the fact that much later on, in 2007, 11 years after its initial appearance, it got this nice hardcover edition is a testament to how much this book and the author mean to the community. And it is a limited edition. Copy 155, signed by the author. Prototype is, in my opinion, the best modern work of transcendent horror. It's hard to describe to people who have not really read horror and are only familiar with horror movies just how far-reaching this book is. Glibly, sometimes I say it's the darkest X-Men story you'll ever read, but that's really just meant as a very vague outline to help people get their hands around what the story might be about. But like all of Hodge's work, there's something cosmic and deeply entrenched in the fabric of what he's doing. It's more about texture and psychology than anything else. And Hodge is one of those people that can spin a story in such a way that you'll never be able to forget it. You'll never quite be the same again. It's also the third of a loose trilogy of novels that I love all three of. There's very little Hodge work that I wouldn't use the word love to describe. This is, to my mind, his ultimate work. That's not to say that what he's done in more recent years isn't absolutely amazing. It's just that my mentality and my soft spot for the genre was perfectly encapsulated in this book. I'd go as far as to say is if you only had money to buy either a copy of Brian's Prototype or one of my books, buy Brian. Even though, you know, it's against my own self-interest. You cannot go through life as a horror reader without reading this book, because if you do, you're going to be missing out on a cornerstone of modern horror. Don't make that mistake. Get a hold of this book. This signed edition is awesome, but honestly, I was just as happy to own and proudly display the old Del Abyss paperback. It's just, this story is that good. And Brian is so close to my heart in what he brings to the genre, the seriousness and the intelligence. He never looks down his nose at the genre. He always treats it with respect, and the readership with respect, and an expectation of intelligence and humanity, which you don't always get. So yeah, Brian Hodge, Prototype. Next up is Cold Chills, a story collection from Robert Bloch, who everyone, of course, knows as the author of Psycho. Psycho was such a powerful book when it came out that Hitchcock's interest in it as a social phenomenon played as much of a role in him wanting to adapt it as the book itself. But there really wasn't the psycho thriller as we think about it as a literary form before Bloch took it on. No one had done it with such ferociousness. I always say this, when people ask how much difference there is between the book and the movie, there really isn't much, except the book is a lot rougher. It's a rougher read. Mary Crane is decapitated in that shower. It's one line, but it's little things like that, little flourishes that just make you realize that, especially when Bloch wrote it, this was some hardcore stuff. This was not an easy read for a lot of people. It was not a beach read. But it became a social phenomenon. Hitchcock's antenna went up. He made a film of it. And, of course, Bloch's career after that was unstoppable. His work with Amicus to the anthology films, all legendary. This is a collection of short stories. It's pretty great. I did buy it secondhand, but I did not pay a ton for it. Because I don't think the person selling it had ever opened it to see that it was signed. And it does not have any outward markings to suggest it was. This is probably my favorite collection of short stories from Bloch. He went through massive movements in his own fiction. His early stuff was very much informed by his heroes who he was massively in touch with, people like H.P. Lovecraft, who he conversed in letters with when he was just a teenager. Later on, once Psycho kind of hit, he became the kind of, neighborhood horror type of writer, whereas the stories were very human. They were very, very, very not supernatural. So kind of like incredibly hard crime. Kind of the Thomas Harris thing, before Thomas Harris. And then at the end of his career, he tended to go more towards supernatural, cozy supernatural. I think he was trying to get into that mode of kind of the Richard Matheson type of spooky supernatural horror. And I think all those movements in his career all made sense. This Cold Chills is a collection that's the center of the career, so it's mainly human horror as its focus. Next up, Bethanys Sen by Robert McCammon. This is the British hardcover, which came out many years after the original American release of the book. But again, there we go. Bethanys Sen is, in one respect, very much a book of its time. It kind of takes, it's kind of a satirical take on kind of the Stephen King thing mixed with a little bit of the Earl Levine type of horror. It definitely is kind of a War of the Sexes horror. I don't want to give everything away, but it's kind of a more outright horror version of Stepford Wives. It's a great, great novel in itself as a page-turner. But it was not a novel that actually launched his career. His career would really take off much later with things like Swan Song. But Bethanys Sen is early McCammon, so you can really see the writer before there was commercial expectations for his work, and I think that's fascinating to see him a little bit unchained and a little bit untethered, and what might, maybe had he not blown up so big in the 80s, the work might have been different. I'm not going to say better or worse, but different. I think especially after Swan Song, there was an expectation of what a McCammon novel would look like, and I don't know, he may not feel that affected his writing, but from the outside in, you can kind of see a McCammon novel develop, right? This is before that. This is a little bit riskier. Next up, Sin Eater by Elizabeth Massey. Book club edition of this wonderful novel with a big, bold Liz Massey autograph. So Sin Eater, if you don't know this book, it made a huge splash when it came out. It won awards. It really put Elizabeth on the map, and with good reason. For my money, pound per pound, she is the most solid character developer in horror fiction. And this book was over the top great in developing characters that you could really, if not identify with, you knew exactly who they were, and you could identify people in your life that they were very much an avatar for. She's great at character work. She's amazing at dialogue. I really thought when Sin Eater and then Wire Mesh Mothers, which is actually my favorite of her work, came out, I really thought that she was doing a lot of the work that William Peter Blatty had begun before he kind of stepped back from the horror genre in a lot of ways by making all these supernatural components not secondary but completely complementary towards the supernatural and the characters, and you always had something to follow. And I think her biggest strength as a storyteller is that you keep reading to find out what happens to these characters. And by the end, win, lose, or draw, whether there's a happy ending for the characters or not, there's always a pound of flesh to be paid by both your heroes and your villains to get to the resolution. And her resolutions do have kind of a moral fabric to them, but they're not simple like EC Comics. The bad guys get what they have coming in a poetic and ironic way. It's nothing like that. It's more deeply human and tragic and bleak without necessarily being dark. And I know that's a weird thing if you haven't experienced an Elizabeth Massey novel. A lot of times there's triumphant endings that bum you out. And that's kind of an amazing thing. Again, nothing makes me happier than when a horror story makes me feel things that I could not feel anywhere else. So I promise you two additional books that are not horror books. If you know me at all, you know that I love music and that I grew up with punk rock. And I still count the Sex Pistols' Nevermind the Bollocks as one of my absolute favorite albums. Not only is there not a bad track on that album, every track is legendary. And that's something that you don't get very often in any form of music, let alone punk rock, which I love punk, but I'm not going to fool you. There's a lot of filler on a lot of punk rock records, but there's not a moment of filler on Nevermind the Bollocks. So these are two of my big heroes, and I did get to meet both of them, which made me extraordinarily happy. First, we got the great Steve Jones and his memoir, Lonely Boy, Tales from a Sex Pistol. Steve Jones was, of course, is, of course, the guitarist from the Sex Pistols. He also played bass on all but one track on the record because they didn't have a bassist for the recording of most of the record. He is very much the musical genius behind that album. His book is this amazing story of his life, and it's so candid, and here's the thing. It's written like he speaks. So if you can imagine this, it's like sitting down and just having a beer with him and just talking about the old days. It's amazing. It's self-depreciating. It's very funny, but it's also very sad. I mean, Lonely Boy's in the title of the book, and what you realize is that there's a tragedy of comedy or a comedic tragedy to almost every stage of his life, and it's an amazing life, an amazing story told by someone who they're really, really, really lucky to have had on the planet with us, to give us all this great music and to represent something that I think is really powerful and necessary, which is he was the definition of the working class musician. People used to say that the Sex Pistols couldn't play their instruments, which was never true. They just weren't playing like a band like, Boston or Journey would play their instruments. But you know what? I don't think Boston or Journey have a record that's anywhere near as good as Nevermind the Bollocks. The other book The other book, very much in the same vein, is the great Johnny Lydon's Anger is an Energy, which he signed and drew on. And we'll leave that for your interpretation. So I really I love John Lydon. I think Johnny Rotten was a absolutely necessary creation at the time to refocus music away from all those elements that had become safe and pedestrian. You know, you could listen to a lot of 70s rock with your parents and feel that's completely fine. But the Pistols came out just like Black Sabbath or Alice Cooper, and this was stuff that was kind of dangerous to listen to, even with friends. Like, friends would look at you funny for embracing these bands. And John Lydon represented open social revolution at a time when that was not normal. He was considered an anarchist, which was not true, by the way. He was interested in people's reaction to the idea of anarchy and the idea that the social order that they thought was inevitable or necessary was just one idea. Lydon himself was a provocateur, but he was also genuinely interested in the human condition and never was full of hate. Anger, he would argue, as he does in this book, is a necessary tool to overcome hostility. But hostility in itself, or even anger into of itself, is not noble. But when there is injustice to be faced, then it is the only rational path. And this book is a great memoir, which plays mostly as memoir, but it does have a lot of personal philosophy in it. It does tell you a lot about his history. His childhood is absolutely tragic. That he overcame it and became a global treasure is amazing. So I hope you've enjoyed looking through these books. Again, I'm not the biggest collector of signed books. This isn't all I have by any means. I have a lot more. But I don't go out of my way for them. They just tend to find their way to me. Certainly if I meet a writer or someone who's written a book at least, I do like to buy the book from them and have him sign it. That does mean something. It just doesn't mean as much as the story contained therein. So, anyway, I really hope all of you have enjoyed. Please subscribe if you haven't. Tell people that you liked the video. And we'll see you soon.
You know, like, share, subscribe, all that fun stuff.
Either way.
Do it if you like.
Nature.
Take a look.
Burned my skin, futzed around in the water, driftwood all over the beach.